The room is getting quiet. That must be a sign to begin. So I think I'll take the clue. My name is Frank Clooney. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of World Religions, which is across the street. We'll have a nice reception after this event over there, and you're all welcome to it. But I'd like to welcome you on part of Dean Hempton and the Divinity School and the Center, which are co-sponsoring a series of events now on religion and the election. So just a week ago, many of you were here. Randall Balmer from Dartmouth came down to speak about religion and the presidency since JFK. And I think our understanding of our contribution to the current, obviously, great interest in our culture and our society and the media on religion, the presidency, the elections, politics, and the state of religious matters in our country is that as a divinity school and a center for the study of world religions, we can bring a certain kind of perspective and a certain kind of answer to the larger questions that everyone is talking about. And I think having that event last week, and then tonight this event on religion and the election, does it matter? Definitely a leading question that allows every speaker to take their own perspective, is a way of opening up a conversation that, again, will get at certain issues that concern everybody, but maybe in a way that this wonderful Div School community at Harvard can bring to the issue for issues that would not otherwise be considered. So my job tonight is simply to introduce our host for the evening, Professor Dan McCannon, who will be moderator of the event, and he'll introduce the speakers. After the speakers have spoken in discussion again, we'll have a reception across the street, but I will turn things over to Dan. Dan has been a member of our faculty here at HDS since 2008. He is the Ralph Waldo Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association Senior Lecturer in Divinity. He came here in 2008 after teaching for 10 years at the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University in Minnesota. Dan is eminently prepared and qualified to be host of a panel dealing with religion, politics, and American culture. His research focuses on religious movements for social transformation in the United States from the abolitionist era to the present, with a particular emphasis on the contributions liberal and esoteric religious traditions have made to socio-political radicalism. He's written a range of books and articles, just to mention what I believe was his first book, Identifying the Image of God, Radical Christians in Nonviolent Power in Antebellum United States, which explored the theological understandings of violence and nonviolence among abolitionists, pacifists, and temperance activists. And his most recent book, which came out in 2011, was entitled Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition. It was the winner of the Frederick G. Melcher Book Award as a general history of religion and the left in the United States. Dan's research includes economic and ecological themes, esoteric traditions such as the Rosicrucian tradition, spiritualism, and theosophy, as well as working on the Unitarian Universalist tradition. So I will now happily turn things over to Dan, and let's welcome him.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Frank, for saying that I'm eminently qualified to moderate this conversation. I do have to add the proviso that most of the people I study have been incapable of winning elections in the United States. So we have these four wonderful panelists who will shed light on the people who win and the people who lose elections. I will introduce all four of them in alphabetical order, which is the order in which they will speak. J. Bryan Hehir is the Parker Gilbert Montgomery Professor of the Practice of Religion and Public Life at Harvard's Kennedy School. But that is not all he is. He is also the Secretary for Healthcare and Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston. And throughout his career, Father Hehir has mastered this two jobs at once approach, balancing academic work with service to church and society. Early in his career, he served on the staff of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops and taught at Georgetown. More recently, he served as Dean of Harvard Divinity School and as National CEO of Catholic Charities, the umbrella organization for Catholic service work. He has taught and written widely on ethics and foreign policy, on Catholic social teaching, and on religion and public life. Next, we will have Rabbi Ruth Langer, who is Professor of Theology and Associate Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. She received her undergraduate degree from Bryn Mawr and her rabbinic degree and her doctorate from Hebrew Union College. Professor Langer's research focuses on Jewish worship and on Jewish-Christian dialogue and relations, topics that she combined in her most recent book, Cursing the Christians, A History of the Birkat HaMinim. She's also the author of To Worship God Properly, Tensions Between Liturgical Custom and Halakha in Judaism, and the co-editor of Liturgy in the Life of the Synagogue. Then we'll have Max Perry Mueller, who is the associate editor of the online news journal Religion and Politics, and I think there are some advertisements for that journal floating about the hall, and currently a PhD candidate in the Committee on the Study of Religion here at Harvard. Max is a graduate of Carleton College as well as of Harvard's MTS program, and he's now writing a dissertation called Half-Breed Americans, Mormon Americans, African Americans, Native Americans, and the Formation of Race in 19th Century America. And he's bringing together the social history of Mormonism with textual analysis of the Book of Mormon and critical race studies. His writing has appeared in many journals ranging from the Journal of Mormon History to Slate and The Atlantic. And finally, we have Reverend Dr. Jonathan Walton, Plummer Professor of Christian Morals, Pusey Minister in the Memorial Church, and Professor of Religion and Society here at the Divinity School, where he has taught since 2010. Professor Walton received his BA at Morehouse and his MDiv and doctoral degrees at Princeton Theological Seminary. He taught at the University of California, Riverside before coming to Harvard. He's the author of Watch This, The Ethics and Aesthetics of Black Televangelism, which, like all of his writings, blends historical and ethical perspectives to offer a deeper understanding of African American religious traditions. Please join me in welcoming all of our panelists.
Well, let me begin by expressing my appreciation. I always enjoy, in many different ways, coming back to the Divinity School. Don't get here as often as I ought to, but it's always both a pleasant experience and very often challenging intellectually in many different ways. So I'm grateful, Dean Hampton, to be here, and to Frank Clooney, an old friend. So I appreciate the opportunity not only to return to the Divinity School, but to talk about this question, because it seems to me the question is important to the university, it's important to the religious community, and I would want to argue that it is important to the civil community. Indeed, that's really the way I'd like to begin. The subtitle of the panel is Does this matter? Religion and politics. Does religion matter? And my first question would be, matter to whom? The question itself has a bit of a sense of payoff about it. Does it matter? My colleague, Stanley Hoffman, with whom I team teach, reminds me all the time that a political ethic always must be able to count consequences. And so I appreciate the significance of payoffs when one is talking about religion and politics. But I think the question almost is a bit too utilitarian for me. That is to say, does it matter? Has the sense of where you would come down in the polling data. But I think we ought to ask the question, matter to whom? There is, I think, an intrinsic significance to raising this question of religion and politics. And even if it didn't matter highly in the polls, that intrinsic significance of bringing the question up of religion and politics and arguing the relationship between them means that it ought to be done. Matter to whom? To the religious traditions themselves, if they are to be faithful to their mandate, faithful to their traditional role, faithful to the sense of what it means to be a religious community. It seems to me the first answer is it would matter a great deal if religious traditions remain silent when the question is religion and politics, and when the issues of the day are the issues we face in this country. Secondly, matter to whom? To the ancient question of how you relate the citizenship of believers, or citizens and disciples. Our civic health, I think, may depend greatly on how well individual citizens are able to answer the question of the relationship of religion and politics. Some may not find the question worth asking, but many do. In a society in which religion is pervasively present by any standard poll that one finds, I think the way citizens ask questions of discipleship and discipleship asks questions of citizenship is intrinsically important in a democracy. Thirdly, as Professor Clooney has indicated, the religious traditions ought to be able to ask questions which give an answer to whom in the sense of civil society, that in addition to our own intrinsic fidelity to our religious traditions or the intrinsic fidelity of asking how citizens think about discipleship and citizenship, it does seem to me that the state of the political debate is not so fulsomely carried out in this society that religion can't bring to that discussion light, wisdom, and compassion. So on all three counts, I think I would answer the question to whom there is a significance to this issue. So it makes a difference. It matters, I think, and the absence of religious discussion would make a difference at all three of those levels: citizenship, religious traditions, and the civil discussion. The second theme, it seems to me, is to look at how religion has made a difference in different elections. Religion, it seems to me, has always been at least implicitly present in any election in this country, or at least most. But at other times, it has become explicitly present. And so while it has always been there, in recent elections, it seems to have been there more visibly than in the past. And as you try to chart this, it does seem to me that the election of John F. Kennedy raised the religious question to an explicit level, and since then, while it hasn't been equally explicit in every election, it has been in several. The Kennedy case is interesting. I take it you may have heard some of this last week. But certainly the standard view was that Kennedy never wanted to raise the question of his religion, or perhaps better, to respond to questions about his religion. As he put it to his staff, he wanted to talk about the real issues. And by that, I think he did not mean to denigrate religion, but I do think his point was that he wanted to run on the issues that a president would have to decide on. For in his mind, the dominant ones were foreign policy. His answer, when he was forced to answer the question, because that's really what happened by this time in the election in 1960, his advisors told him by the third week in October or so that if he didn't address the question of his religious faith, that he would likely lose the election. And so he addressed it. That address has served as a kind of baseline for debate since then. I would say he addressed it in institutional terms. He had to answer the question about whether his affiliation with Catholicism would make his incumbency in the presidency tainted, if you will. And he answered it in a particular way, a kind of absolutist way, arguing that he would separate radically his religious faith and his duties to office. Now, he did say if a conflict ever came, then he would resign the office. But since then, people have asked whether he separated the two things, his faith and his office, too radically. And perhaps more importantly, I think most agree that in the context of the last 10 to 15 years, it would have been impossible for a candidate to give Kennedy's answer to the question without being pressed very hard, not simply by the media, but particularly by religious voices. Kennedy answered the question in institutional terms. Since then, the question has taken on more of a personal character question. That is to say, it isn't what religious faith you belong to and whether that would influence you, but where do you stand on this issue, that issue. It has become more a test for some of the character of the person they are electing. And this has become the case not in every election since Kennedy, but in several. If you turn to the question of what not the candidate can answer, but what the religious tradition might bring to this particular election, I return to the question of the state of the public debate. Is religion and politics directly connected in this election? Well, let me argue that it should be in three different areas. In three different areas, it seems to me, religious traditions have something to say to issues that are being discussed in secular context and should be raised in religious moral terms. I submit domestic policy, foreign policy, and healthcare all raise questions that the religious traditions can bring to bear insight, even if the insight then becomes a source of debate in the wider society. In domestic policy, the primacy of the economy is self-evident. But how the economy question is answered is interesting from a religious moral perspective. There is more than one way to interpret what has come to be called the option for the poor as one thinks about social economic policy. But my way of thinking about it is that the principle of the option for the poor is always correlated with the principle of the common good. That is to say, we should make policy for the good of all, but when we are concerned about the good of all, within that context, there needs to be a weighted concern for the most vulnerable. Now, we have economic problems that concern everyone. No one doubts that deficit and debt need to be handled in the long term. But how they are handled is precisely where the option for the poor is helpful, where you begin to think about how you will balance deficit reduction, debt reduction, and fiscal policy is precisely the point at which the option for the poor, within the context of the wider common good of addressing deficit and debt, is a useful contribution. In foreign policy, simply to raise the questions and force debate upon them would be a service. It simply is not responsible for the most powerful nation in the world to be able to go day by day, week by week, and never discuss what its future role in the world is to be. Now, to raise that question raises very complicated issues. Let me illustrate it without resolving it. But certainly at the heart of the discussion of foreign policy is the question of Iran, nuclear proliferation, and how that issue will be handled. Now, the question of nuclear proliferation is a question that is wider than Iran, broader than Iran, and in the long term is a question that must find better resolution than it has found so far. Because the nuclear proliferation question poses, it seems to me, an ethical paradox of some substance. On the one hand, there is the need to restrict access to nuclear weapons. A world of 20 or 30 nuclear weapons is simply a world that verges on the insane. But our way of dealing with that question is the non-proliferation regime. Now, if you look at the non-proliferation regime from the point of view of an ethical argument, what you get is an inherently discriminatory treaty. So then the question becomes, is it permissible to defend and support an inherently discriminatory treaty in light of what's at stake with nuclear proliferation? To move down a road that would take me much longer to defend, I would want to argue that a consequentialist case supporting the nuclear non-proliferation regime trumps the deontological principle of fairness in this case. And the point is that if that is the case, then there has to be not simply arguments about how we would threaten anyone who would pursue nuclear weapons. We've got to deal with the question in the wider perspective of the world of how to reduce the privileges that come with nuclear weapons. In the long term, there needs to be a fairness outcome. In the short term, we have to deal with the question of fairness to those who raise questions about an inherently discriminatory regime. Finally, the healthcare debate is multidimensional, and therefore religion can bring a multidimensional perspective to bear. It is, first of all, a question of social justice. That is the coverage question. It can become, secondly, a question of bioethics. There are serious bioethical questions about the future and direction of healthcare. And on both of these counts, the religious tradition, it seems to me, has something to say. So in those three broad areas, it is, in answer to the question, does it make a difference? I would argue from the religious moral perspective, it should make a difference, and therefore it depends on the quality of the response religious traditions bring to these broad questions.
Let me also begin by thanking my friend Frank Clooney for the invitation to cross the river. When my son moved to Cambridge, we assured him that the Cambridge River was, or that the Charles River was deep and wide, and that we would not bother him too much. And so actually the perspective from Newton is that it is actually a fair ways to come. That this is sort of slightly foreign territory, although it need not be, maybe shouldn't be so much. I am trying today to present sort of the highlights, the bullet points of a Jewish perspective on this evening's question. And I just want to say from the outset that I'm trying to speak from a broader perspective and hopefully won't play my hand too strongly in terms of the way that I would choose to vote in this election or my particular stances, but to speak about the breadth of ideas that are out there in our complex Jewish community. The first thing to say, though, is that the Jewish community is really not to be thought of as a faith community, especially when it comes to civic participation in an American election. But it's really much more a cultural community, and a community that, perhaps even an ethnic community, that's drawn together by history, by a group of concerns, but not necessarily by belief, by feeling that these things are coming down from above in any way from God. So these aren't necessarily religious concerns and not necessarily religious teachings, which are drawing all the different points that I want to raise now. First and foremost on the agenda of the Jewish community in coming into any kind of national political issue is really the international issue of Israel. Does a candidate stand for Israel and support Israel? And that's the question that was raised even in terms of the Senate race. My daughter was working for Elizabeth Warren this summer, and friends of ours said, well, what does Elizabeth Warren have to say about Israel? She didn't show up at the Israel Independence Day celebration. That didn't speak well for her. What does that say? So we went and we dug around in the website and said, oh yeah, she says the right things there, but she needs to be pushed to come out. And these kinds of things are shaping consciousness and shaping responses from within the Jewish community. Now, what are the things that matter within this? Obviously, first and foremost, we need to talk about the peace process. And there, the Jewish community has deep concerns, so in certain corners of the community at least, over Obama's lack of understanding of the nuances of the region. There was a sense that Bill Clinton knew every inch of the country. He knew when a town was mentioned. He could visualize it. He knew what the issues were. He knew what the emotional issues were, and he knew what the political issues were, and therefore he could speak with some credibility, not only to the Israelis, but also to the Palestinians over these issues. Whereas with President Obama, there's been a regular call for a return to pre-1967 borders. The borders that were in existence before the Six-Day War in 1967 are armistice lines from 1969, which are, from 1949, I'm sorry, which are not boundaries of viable states for anyone concerned. And he hasn't visited Israel to see for himself what he's talking about. Again, speaking from the perspective of the Jewish community, and I know not from the perspective of the Palestinian community, settlements are not all of one sort. There's some which are in areas which were conquered by mostly Jordan in 1948, reconquered by Israel 19 years later in 1967, and these are areas to whom elements of the Jewish community have very, very strong historical and emotional attachments. Some of these are areas that have been rebuilt. Some of these are areas which are going to be more easily seated in a two-state solution. But some of the areas 45 years after the Six-Day War are very much part of the Jewish state, very much part of the city of Jerusalem particularly. And to speak about them without knowing on the ground how this looks, how this feels, is something which is seen as being very problematic within parts of the Jewish community. In terms of where the settlement peace process will go, there's a Jewish sensitivity to the Palestinian insistence that the eventual Palestinian state will not have a single Jewish resident in it. Israel has 20% Palestinian citizens in it, and there's a lack a in that. I'm not saying that the Palestinian residents or Palestinian citizens in Israel proper have a completely equal status, that there aren't some problems there that need to be addressed, but that needs to be part of the map also. And that the Abbas's refusal to recognize Israel as a Jewish state when Palestine is going to be a Palestinian state is also a lack of parity and something that hits very hard at the Jewish community. And these are things which are part of the international agenda, but when Jews are voting in the United States, they are looking out for who's going to be concerned about this. How do we get to a point that not all the compromises are going to be compromises being demanded of Israel? Israel fell into the 1967 situation. Israel was about to be attacked. One territory that it hadn't intended to conquer in 1967, and when they offered to give it back in September of 1967, the Arab League said no to Israel, no peace agreement, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with it. And that's what created the situation of Israel having occupied territory with a majority citizenship of people who are hostile to it. This does need a solution, but how requires involvement on the part of American politicians and knowledge on the ground, rather than standing back and letting other people feed information in. And of course, part of this is also the Iranian nuclear threat, which is an existential threat to Israel. Not all Israelis by any means are survivors of the Holocaust, but a substantial number are. And of course, the aftermath of the Holocaust was one of the catalysts in the formation of Israel as a state. Anybody who threatens to wipe Israel off the face of the earth is threatening a Holocaust. And the Israeli promise through the Israeli mentality is not to allow that to happen again. And the Jewish community stands behind that. The reality is that we're not just talking about Iran, but we're talking about Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, armed with tens of thousands of missiles of increasing sophistication, some of which have the ability to hit Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is the largest single Jewish community in the world right now, larger than Greater New York. So we are talking about something which is not a minor threat, it's not a little blip, but it's something about which the Jewish community, or much of it, cares very, very deeply. Now, to turn to the domestic issues, the thing which has really drawn the Jewish community together, and this more so even than Israel issues, is over the years has been concerns for things that we would lump under the heading of social justice. So for the Jewish community, the fact that there be a social safety net that includes health care, that includes issues that address poverty and try to solve poverty, that try to provide for the poor, that give a strong education system and provide access to education, is very high on the agenda of the Jewish community. And I would say some of the roots of this are tied to the same roots that led many Jews a century ago, basically, and more, to be drawn to socialism. There were many, many Jewish socialists in Eastern Europe, particularly, the Bund, and strong Jewish socialist movements even in the United States with the Eastern European immigrants. And this was not a reflection of what became all the problems of communism or anything like that. This was strong social values, the sense that the government has a responsibility to take care of to ensure that society has a way to take care of and promote the well-being of every single one of its members. And that would extend, in my own count, to things like having an infrastructure for our society to live on, to building bridges and roads and things like that. At the liberal end of today's Jewish spectrum, this extends to full support for same-sex families, to individuals who are gay, lesbian, and their full rights, and access to safe abortion as needed. Not because abortion is a good, of course, but because it's a tragic necessity for some people, especially according to Jewish understandings. If the pregnancy is somehow threatening the physical or mental health of the mother, then abortion is something which can be justified. And so this then also enters into the public discourse in terms of a Jewish understanding of what the government ought to be taking care of. The traditional end of the Jewish spectrum might support legalized abortion, not because they expect members of our own community to be using it, but because of an understanding that others might be making different choices. And this arises from a sense that Judaism is not a religion which is teaching universal values, but is teaching values for its own community, and therefore other people may have other sets of values, and that we can accept those and give them respect. And I would say the same thing might be true for same-sex marriage. That's a little bit more debatable in that discussion. And then this also then attracts discussion about the Massachusetts ballot initiative, particularly about physician-assisted suicide, where giving dignity to the dying is a deep Jewish value. It's something deeply embedded in the tradition. But this does not include or require taking extreme or invasive measures in order to prolong life. But at the same time, taking active measures to end life is something that is prohibited, and so even the rabbis at the liberal end of the spectrum in Massachusetts have been organizing against this particular initiative. Two more points that I want to get to. How much time do I have still?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay, I'll be quick. The freedom of religion discussion, which has come up recently. For Jews, freedom of religion has traditionally translated into separation of church and state. And this means that there's been a movement in the civil realm, and Jewish support for the movement in the civil realm away from the identification with the values of a specific social group. It's been good for Jews that America is more a secular society, that there hasn't been, as my parents had, the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of the school day in public school. But that the American public realm is more religion-free, and people are encouraged to be independently religious. And this means then that religion lies at the realm of individuals and individual choices, and not at the level of civic institutions. And religious institutions then have to influence and attract people by competition with each other. And this actually has resulted, as my husband argues, for an extremely healthy religious world in America, and we can compare this to the secularism that's rampant in Europe, for instance. And finally, the Jewish community is very aware that the next president is likely going to make Supreme Court appointments which are going to influence the way the court is going to swing. We're at basically a 5-4 court these days, and the justices most likely to be retiring are at the liberal end of the court, generally supporting the issues and the directions that most of the Jewish community is supportive of. So that also then influences Jewish understandings and Jewish views as to how one ought to be thinking about the implications of this particular election.
So I also would like to offer my thanks to Dean Hempton, who's also my advisor. He'd probably prefer that I be in the library typing out pages in my dissertation, but I got my page done earlier today, Dean Hempton. And I also would like to offer my thanks to Dr. Clooney for his invitation. I want to start my brief talk today on asking this question. We've talked a lot in American popular discourse about the Mormon moment that 2011-2012 brings to us. And I'd like to step back a little bit and ask, which moment or whose moment actually is this? So of course, Romney, Governor Romney, his candidacy has brought Mormonism into the fore, probably in an unprecedented way. So has a Broadway musical, and there's a great review in the HDS Bulletin, which I highly recommend, on the Book of Mormon musical. And actually, the church is engaging in both of these areas, both in this pop cultural arena and in the election, in really interesting ways. It's now ubiquitous I Am Mormon campaign, which a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen pop up on your religiously related websites. But if you go to Los Angeles and see the Book of Mormon play, you will also see an advert in your playbill for the I Am Mormon campaign. So they're taking even that opportunity. But again, stepping back and asking, whose moment? Now, with the bishops and the sisters and the laity on many sides of this election season, the Catholics, perhaps in an unprecedented way, and we've heard a little bit from Professor Hehir about this, and both presidential, vice presidential candidates are Catholics. This could also be very much a Catholic moment in presidential politics. Also, as Romney and President Obama squabble over who will best defend Israel and who best represents Jews, this could also be a Jewish moment. And finally, because my scholarship is in race and Mormonism, and hopefully not simply the black and white binary, but still, when I see Mitt Romney on stage with the first black president, I can't help but see also Mormonism's long and complicated relationship with African Americans. So this election of Mitt Romney, perhaps more than other GOP candidates, means, for me at least, the black moment in American presidential politics did not end, in fact, with the election of President Obama in 2008 and continues in 2012. So I'd ask us to consider which moment or whose moment is this? And if there is such a moment, will it matter? So I'm the unofficial, and I mean very unofficial, Mormon on the panel. I'm sure you were all expecting to come see real-life Mormon, that peculiar thing, but I am not it, unfortunately. But I do study the tradition quite a lot. So let me try to explore some of the ways in which Mormonism will play out in this election, or is playing out. And I'd actually like to do so by talking about three separate but overlapping entities of Mormonism: the church, Mormons, and the world. So those are my three entities. So first of all, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as the church public affairs office would like us to use the full title. And this is where we start when we think of Mormonism. So it begins to be, it makes sense to begin here. Now, first question, does the church want Mitt Romney to win? The church will say, and often says, actually, as soon as Mitt Romney got the official nomination, there was a press release that went out that reaffirmed the church's neutrality on political parties and in its stance against endorsing a particular candidate. So the church is officially very neutral. And in fact, before the nomination, during the nomination process, many, I would say, in the church, even in the church hierarchy, would hope that he wouldn't win the nomination and that this moment would go away so they could get back to the business of running the church. Now I think that many in Salt Lake are pretty happy that he's the nominee, though again it's important to point out that he is an outsider to the Utah church and the Utah Mormon culture. He's a Boston Mormon, more than a Provo Mormon. And if you visit the Belmont ward where Mitt Romney served as a bishop, the Boston or the Belmont Saints will say Boston or Belmont is Zion, not Utah. So there's actually an intention that's important. So second, the Mormons. We dealt with the church. Second, the Mormons. Now, is there, and this is often a big fear and an old fear, is there a Mormon voting bloc? Are these Mormons going to vote all in lockstep? Pew, in the recent survey, says that has found that 74% of Mormons are Republicans or lean Republican. And a Gallup poll found that 84% are backing Mitt Romney. So there actually is a 10-point shift just with the nomination of Mitt Romney. So there is certainly an interest in his candidacy among the saints. Now, I'd like to step back and compare that with the first Mormon presidential candidate, Joseph Smith Jr. in Nauvoo. And Joseph, actually, I would say, had a harder time getting his membership to follow in line with the church than Romney is here. So he had a harder time keeping his community unified. Yet, and this is where I'd like to focus my talk, there's quite a bit of political diversity. When I asked my Mormon friends, what should I talk about? They kept on saying, Mormons aren't all Republicans. Mormons aren't all Republicans. Highlight that. So here I go. And this came out in the squabble, pretty heated squabble, between Mitt Romney and Harry Reid. And I think this goes deeper than simply party politics. It touches on the ideological and theological diversity within the church. Reid emphasizes a strain of Mormonism that in some sense is more communitarian. In 19th century Mormonism, we can find experimentation with communitarianism, even socialism in Utah. Romney's emphasis is more on self-making, spiritual and economic, through what Mormons would call human agency and on the individual, the ability, actually the responsibility for saints to make their own way together with God in the world. So, of course, there are Mormons for Obama that we've heard about, and Democratic Mormons, but there are even progressive Mormons. And it actually has perhaps been their best year in decades, if not ever. Besides Mitt Romney, the most famous Mormon in America this year has become Joanna Brooks, a professor at the University of California in San Diego, a blogger at Religion Dispatches, and the Mormon It Girl. Now, here I use the word girl with caution. She is a tenured professor, but she uses that word herself in the title of her now ubiquitous book, The Book of Mormon Girl, which talks about her own upbringing as she struggled with faith. She's been on Jon Stewart, the Jon Stewart show, and when she told him, when they were talking about that Mormons are actually babies in the scope of a religious traditions, they're only 180 years old, she asked Jon Stewart, can we grow up to be like you? In other words, to be like Jews. And of course, he said, if you're lucky. To the frustration of many conservatives in Temple Square, Joanna has been the many journalists' first call on all things Mormon. And her writing and speaking, she emphasizes the power of the tradition of Mormonism, of eternal families, loving and accepting communities, and not the hierarchical authority of the church. For Joanna and others, Proposition 8 was a crisis of faith, and others like the filmmaker Kendall Wilcox, a former BYU filmmaker, and a gay man are working from the outside of the church, from the outside of the church structure, to create a Mormon community that embraces gay saints as equals. And this summer, there was a flowering and a very large participation of Mormons in gay rights parades. And theologically, scholars like our own alum Taylor Petrie have argued for what he called in an article in the journal Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, towards a post-heterosexual Mormon theology in which the church places less emphasis on the type of sex that is actually happening, but more on the kind of relationships that are being fostered. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, again, occurring from the outside of the church. Now, recently, just this past weekend, the church held its annual general conference, and Dallin Oaks, an apostle, decried divorce, cohabitation, and the rearing of adopted children in gay families. And so his voice is, as the prophet of God, his voice is officially normative for the church. But Joanna and Taylor and others are also trying to assert that their voices are Mormon too. Third part of this discussion, what I'll call the world, formerly known as Gentiles. Us folk who have been gazing upon the Mormons for a long, long time, which is in some ways at least half the story in a lot of ways about what we know of Mormons. Now, a lot of questions from the world have come up. Is Mormonism a threat to democracy? Is it a cult? Is it a cabal to take over the government? Now, these kind of questions in a lot of ways have died down. Ironically, now the fear among many conservatives is that Mitt Romney's Mormonism will suppress turnout among conservative evangelicals. Just this morning, there was an AP story reporting about these fears from AP religion reporter Rachel Zoll. I think this. I think we can think about this much like we think about the black church leaders who are arguing that urging blacks to stay, or African Americans to stay away from the polls because Romney is a Mormon, and thus some would say a racist and not a Christian. And Obama has abandoned his Christianity with his evolved stance on homosexuality. Now, both of these groups are loud, but in the end, I think African Americans will vote for Obama, and evangelicals will come home to Romney. I'd offer two data points. First is my father. My father is a conservative Christian, an evangelical Christian, and I talked to him over this weekend, which is our annual. It feels like to him annual, weekly call, Sunday call. So he informed me, we try not to talk about politics, but he informed me that he's been calling on behalf of Romney. And my father does not think what I do is studying Mormons is necessarily very theologically useful. So I thought that was kind of funny. And he's actually been calling Spanish-speaking Catholics in South Florida because he speaks some Spanish, and the script he's been given is designed specifically for Catholic outreach. So he's a former Huckabee supporter, then a Ron Paul supporter, now backing Mitt Romney and reaching out to this evangelical, calling to Catholics on behalf of Mormon. That's one data point. The second, perhaps more well-known, is Al Mohler, who recently held a conference, somewhat like ours today, down at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which he called the Mormon Moment, Religious Conviction and the 2012 Election. Now, the takeaway point from that group, that session, was that evangelical leaders, ironically enough, are emphasizing today the point that religion should not be a consideration when voting. Let me repeat that. Evangelicals are saying we should not worry about a candidate's faith when voting. And this is obviously in response to the nomination of Governor Romney. Now, last week, Professor Plummer talked about the Kennedy paradigm, when between Kennedy and Nixon, at least in a public expression of it, religion was divorced from the presidency because of that particular religion. President and Kennedy's religion made many Americans nervous. And this is what, ironically, I see Mueller and other evangelicals advocating for as they line up behind Romney. So let me offer, in conclusion, if we care to pay attention, we've learned a lot about Mormonism this year, perhaps this year more than any time in American history. And I'd like to emphasize, again, the theological and political diversity, which has always been a part of the Mormon tradition. Because Mormonism is so popular right now, we go out to dinner parties, my wife and I, and she tells me I'm only allowed to speak about Mormonism for 5 minutes. So the fact that you've offered me 15 is very generous. And so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Good evening. The term evangelical is slippery. This is a group that's often referenced in regards to American politics, particularly the role of value voters. But who constitutes this group? Al Mohler at Southern Baptist Seminary? Max's father? And what values are they supporting? The group that often comes to mind, and I was saying that not just in jest, is made up of largely white, middle-class, conservative Christians. The white evangelical right, if you will. This is true in part due to the religious right's heightened visibility over the past 3 decades, which is a byproduct of their success in religious broadcasting, the creation of powerful political action groups, homeschooling initiatives, and most notably, their alliance with the Republican Party. Though the term evangelical is often used in popular media and news coverage in slippery and loose ways that would fit well within the categories that Dean Hempton gave us in popular media coverage of religion during his wonderful convocation address, one must realize that the term itself is too broad and inclusive to be reduced to one dominant orientation. Consider the nostalgic yet neoteric belief system known as Christian Reconstructionism in America. Reconstructionists promote the view that for America to survive, the citizens of the nation must be brought back or reconstructed in line with Christian law that this nation was purportedly founded upon. Rooted in the writings of 20th century theologian Rusus John Rushduni, Christian Reconstructionism is nostalgic in regards to the ways that it obscures America's tragic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant history of violent conquest, racial and gender exclusion, and religious discrimination by casting America's contemporary story as a narrative of decline. And it's neoteric insofar as it obscures the anti-Catholic bias and anti-Semitic legacy of Protestantism in America towards developing a disingenuous alliance between Protestant fundamentalism, Catholic conservatives, and Jewish Zionists. Christian Reconstructionism is grounded in a larger tradition, to be sure, of U.S. exceptionalism and a theological narrative of dominionism. I'm talking about one form of evangelicalism here. America is cast as a moral exemplar, blessed and burdened with the specific task of converting the rest of the world toward God's natural law, as embodied in America's dominant religious and civic faith. For the most part, persons who ascribe to this faith interpret God's natural law to include sexuality toward the ends of procreation within a heterosexual monogamous relationship, the nuclear family with women's primary role as mother and the headship of men in all aspects of society. In addition, just as God is believed to have given humans dominion over creation in Genesis 1:26 through 31, Christian Reconstructionists believe it to be their divinely ordained role and responsibility to institute a theocratic Christian state. It's this tradition that we often hear from the right of the Republican Party. Think back to some of the many of the Republican debates. So it's this dominion over the nation and subsequently the entire earth that is the ultimate goal. It's in this regard that Reconstructionists appeal to the Jeremiadic tradition. They view themselves as the intellectual heirs to Puritanism, as Julie Ingersoll states in her wonderful writings on Christian Reconstructionists. Some have tried in American society, now that I have given you one far right side of evangelicalism that often becomes overdetermining of the entire group. Some have tried to counter this with appeals to the progressive evangelical tradition in America. Progressives reference this tradition that produced abolitionists, social gospel reformers, women's suffrage, civil rights activists, no matter how disenchanted many of them may be. Think Reverend Jeremiah Wright and his understanding of the oppositional relationship between institutional power of the political sphere and prophetic truth-telling from the pulpit. This tradition, too, appeals to the Jeremiad, particularly the Afro-American Jeremiadic tradition, from David Walker and Maria Stewart to Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer. And this particular strand of evangelicalism is situated as always and already opposed to injustice and outside the gates, calling down fire from heaven on injustice. So you have two sides here, both appealing to the Jeremiadic tradition, both seeking to call the nation back. Though, of course, there is an imbalance of power here because one is pointing upward toward power and one, the former, Christian Reconstructionist, tends to point downwards. That is to say, it's feminists, gays, lesbians, civil rights work, that is, causing the nation to go to hell in a handbasket. I believe that it's important for us to disrupt a progressive evangelical political response as always and already in conflict with the powers that be, no matter how much me and my dear brother right here would love for that to be the case. Just as we must disrupt a popular conceptions of American evangelicalism as always and already racially white and politically right. Such assumptions, I believe, even compromise social scientific polling, which often delineates Christian faith communities according to somewhat static and racially fractured categories, such as evangelical Protestants, Protestant mainlines, Black Protestants, non-Hispanic Catholics, and Hispanic Catholics. Such rubrics were used, for instance, by a research team out of Henry Institute with the most recent national survey on religion and public life that examined the 2008 election. According to their findings, despite repeated overtures from the Democratic Party toward evangelicals, quote unquote, Christian evangelicals, their voting preferences, Christian evangelicals, changed little, if at all, over the course of the past decade. Evangelical faith-based voting remained decidedly Republican, according to their findings, with the only real movement taking place among Black Protestants, which there was a double-digit shift from George W. Bush to Barack Obama from 2004 to 2008. And Latino Protestants, there was 58% ended up supporting Obama. And Hispanic Catholics, over 70% supported Obama. You see what I'm getting at? In other words, there was no movement among evangelicals except for when we talk about Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, and Latino Protestants. Otherwise, there's no movement among evangelicals. But what about the fact that all 7 of the established historically Black denominations are evangelical in both their origins and current orientations? Or what do we do with the fact that among all combined Latino Protestants and Catholics in America, 37% consider themselves born again or evangelical? The phenomenon that Gaston Espinosa refers to as the Pentecostalization of Catholicism among U.S. Latino Christians. This could be the reason, I'm suggesting, why the term evangelical has become such a contested category. One that reveals a disconnect between many established evangelical organizations and everyday people on the ground. For instance, according to the Barna Group, George Barna that is, the Barna Group is considered a leading evaluator of evangelicalism in America for the past few decades. In 2006, 38% of Americans self-identified as evangelicals. Yet when measured against the 9-point criteria derived from the belief statement of the National Association of Evangelicals, only 8% of Americans would qualify as evangelicals. In real numbers among the adult population, this is the difference between 84 million who self-report and 18 million who meet the Barna criteria. These findings also change the demographic makeup of American evangelicals disproportionately. Self-proclaimed evangelicals are less likely to be married. They have lower household incomes. They are less Southern. They are less conservative. They are less Republican. And they are less white. Thus, this disrupts the vision in the popular imagination of American evangelicals as a white suburban family of 4 along the Southern Crest, where the mom and dad met at Wake Forest, the son is at Baylor, and the daughter plans to join her mother's sorority at UVA. Therefore, I guess the question that I'm raising is, when one considers all of these factors, does the evangelical vote really matter at all? Or is it just something created by the infotainment news cycle to be a nice story about the ways evangelicals impact national elections, as long as we define them in a particular sort of way? How overdetermined must the category of evangelical be to make a difference in polling? It seems to me, if we allow American evangelicals to be as diverse as they actually are, then evangelicals, broadly defined, wouldn't make much of an impact at all. Thank you.